Good morning. My name is Tim Wilkie. I'm one of the co-chairs of this conference. We're very glad to have you joining us for day two. We're very excited to have our keynote speaker this morning. I guess this evening, depending on where you are. Before we begin, I'll just remind everyone that as we have. Those of you who may have missed our welcome session yesterday and are looking for the slides for that, you can find it on the Connections website and examine those there. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Catherine McGrady from CNA to introduce our keynote this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. So I'm very honored to introduce the Honorable Robert Work. Secretary Work made it very clear he doesn't like long introductions, so I'm going to keep mine short, and it's to what he listed as highlights from his amazing bio. So 27 years as an active duty Marine, the 31st Undersecretary of the Navy, CEO of the Center for New American Security, the 32nd Deputy Secretary of Defense, and currently he is the Vice Chair of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. So I want to ask for Secretary Work's indulgence to make one very short addition to what he provided for highlights from his bio. It's an addition that's very important to this audience. When Secretary Work was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, in my view, and in the view of many on this call, he enabled a renaissance of modern gaming. He reinvigorated wargaming by calling out its importance to the US Department of Defense and actually funding those war games. So it's one thing to talk about the importance of wargaming, it's another to actually fund them. Many people attending this conference are here because of Secretary Work's action when he was Deputy Secretary of Defense. So I hope you'll forgive me, Bob, but I wanted to make this point to this audience. And with that, I'll turn the spotlight over to you, Secretary Work.
Thank you, Catherine. It's really great to be here this morning, and I have to start this by making a confession. I just had never heard of Connections, and I add this to one of my long lists of regrets as the Deputy Secretary of Defense, because I believe if I had known about Connections, I might have been able to exploit the vast amount of experience that is gathered here on this call, and those of you who you represent, to really take wargaming in even a further direction than I intended. So I was very excited to get the invitation, and looking at your agenda, I was like a kid in a candy store. I said, God, I wish I could see that one. I wish I could listen to that one. But unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to listen to too many. But I want to jump right into this, and I've got to give you a little bit of history so that I can just get you in my head. So when I'm talking to you about wargaming, you'll understand where I'm coming from. Could I have the next slide, please? All right, quick agenda. I'm just going to go through the first three parts relatively quickly. And get to the wargaming's critical role in this very important period of time, which has all of the ingredients for a new military technical revolution. And it's my view that wargaming is going to help us determine how close we are to that point. So I'll go through what I consider to be the revolution in war, which was unveiled in Desert Storm. Talk to you about the Defense Innovation Initiative, which is what it intended to do. Talk about the third offset strategy and how important AI-enabled autonomy was in it, and what we saw it leading towards, which we called algorithmic warfare. And then talk a lot about wargaming's critical role. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just this is an Air Force chart, but I think it shows Operation Desert Storm was what revolutionary war theorists call a defining battle for a new warfighting regime. What it did is it demonstrated that a new type of warfare rendered either obsolete or subordinate the existing means of warfare, which up until 1990, 1991 was massed combined arms warfare. And even though only 9% of all of the ordnance used in Desert Storm were guided munitions, it was the light bulb. Everyone said, well, holy moly, look at what we could do with just using 9% precision guided munitions. What happens if we used 100%? So where you see the two lines bisect or intersect, that really is the defining battle. The blue line is circular or probable. You'll see it drops from 3,300 feet over Germany in World War II. Just think about that. 50% of all bombs miss their intended target by 1/6 of a mile. And you can see how circular or probable went down and down and down until it's now approaching zero. And at the same time, the percentage of precision guided munitions going from 0% in just around 1965 at the start of the Vietnam War, now generally in the area of 80 to 90%. It introduced a new paradigm of accuracy independent of range. I think you all know that missed distances go up generally with unguided weapons as the range increases. And when you have accuracy independent of range, your warhead size really starts to go down, which allows you to move in different directions. Swarming attacks with smaller effectors. So this was the guided munitions part of the revolution. Next slide, please. Now, to fully exploit accuracy independent range, you need a battle network. The first modern manifestation was the British Homeland Air Defense Network, which at the time was called the Dowding System, after Hugh Dowding, who was the head of RAF Fighter Command. And it demonstrated the 4 canonical grids of all subsequent battle networks. And you have a multi-phenomenology sensor grid. You have a fusion center, a command, control, communications, and intelligence grid. When you added computers, there's a C4I grid. You have the effects grid, which would apply effects on the battlefield to accomplish the commander's objectives. And you had a sustainment and regeneration grid. People tend to forget about that 4th grid, but it's extremely important in warfighting. This just shows a slide. Single-seat fighter production the RAF Fighter Command fighter production went down precipitously at the start of the Battle of Britain, but then started to continuously outproduce the Luftwaffe, and that provided a major important advantage. Next slide, please. So it was the combination of guided munitions and the battle networks that employed them that represented a new revolution, a military technical revolution. And it rendered subordinate, not obsolete, but it rendered subordinate combined arms warfare. Large regional armies that were stuck in the unguided weapons regime were simply reduced to a collection of targets, as the Iraqi army was in Desert Storm. And because the US was the first mover and the Soviet Union soon imploded, the US was the only one who was in this regime. And the sheer scale of our advantage was difficult for any regional power to duplicate. So what did they do? They started to go underground. They started to practice camouflage, concealment, and deception. They started to go mobile. They did everything they could to try to offset the American advantage in guided munitions warfare. And those that could began to pursue nuclear weapons to deter the assembly of the battle network. And Iran and North Korea being the two examples of that. Now, Russia and China, after Desert Storm, they were shocked at how the US dismantled the Iraqi army. I think you all know this. And they were determined to compete head-to-head with the US in the new regime, but it was going to take time to do so. Now, the late, great Andy Marshall had a term called a mature revolutionary regime. And what he meant by that was when the major competitors all achieved rough parity in the existing way of war. And he warned the department as early as 1993, look, we're going to ride this ride for a period of time and we're going to love it. We're going to have every possible advantage. And no one is really going to be able to compete with us conventionally. They're going to try to offset us. They'll do all sorts of other things. But when it comes to conventional warfare, no one's going to stand in our way. But that will change. So he sponsored a series of 20 war games called the 20XX War Game Series, And all the series pondered was, what happens when you reach a mature revolutionary regime and all of the major peer competitors have rough technological parity in the existing means of war? Now I participated in this war game series as one of the best war game series I have ever been a part of. And I would say that it essentially nailed all the key aspects of a mature revolutionary regime and the impact it would have on the US Joint Force. Now, in the 1990s, nobody really wanted to listen to that. But over the course of the 90s, with a series of games, the Army After Next game, Spacecast 2020, in 1997, the Air Force started to do a series of future war games, and the Navy started to really inject a lot of these type of thoughts in their global war game series. So by the end of the 1990s, people were starting to say, okay, I think we're going to have to transform the joint force. And that's what the 2001 QDR essentially said. People forget about it, but I would ask you all, if you ever want to, draw up the 2001 QDR and the 2018 NDS, National Defense Strategy, lay them on top of each other, and you'll see that they're essentially the same thing. They're trying to solve the same problem, the erosion of US military technical superiority. They're trying to figure out how you compete over time and how you might regain a measure of superiority. So we lost 17 years, in my view. The Chinese knew that when we went into the strategic cul-de-sac called the Greater Middle East, they knew they were going to have some time in which they would be able to work to catch up with us. And they got essentially 17 years. Next slide, please. All right, now the Chinese have been thinking about how they're going to surpass the United States for a long time. I think most of you probably know this, but they say, okay, when we reach a mature revolutionary regime, warfare will be characterized by the collision of opposing operational systems, the Chinese name for battle networks. The Russians call them reconnaissance strike complex. So the Chinese said, when everybody is equal in being able to look deep, shoot deep, and kill deep, then what's going to happen is there are going to be these opposing operational systems. So the PLA's theory of victory has said the best way to fight when you have systems confrontation is to destroy the opposing battle network. And you can see the quote at the bottom of the slide. You know, the war is going to be won by the belligerent that can disrupt, paralyze, or destroy the operational system. And the Chinese have added a fifth battle network grid, which they refer to as the information contestation grid. And that grid is centered on fighting system destruction warfare. Next slide. Now, Barry Watts, who I worked with at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment, found this really great chart out of a Soviet manual of some type. And it showed, RUC is the acronym that the Soviets used for Reconnaissance Strike Complex. And it showed a collision of the US Naval Reconnaissance Strike Complex and the Soviet Naval Reconnaissance Strike Complex. So all of the competitors see this the same way. In a mature regime, you're going to have this systems confrontation, and it's not going to be focused on annihilation or attritionist warfare. And the Department of Defense, in my view, still has not accepted this basic fact. This is Central Military Commission Order 1 in 2020. This is coming right from President Xi and the top leadership of the People's Liberation Army. They say all your training is going to be focused on systems confrontation. And so the Chinese are less worried about the number of ships they sink, the number of planes they shoot down, any type of attritionist thing. They are really focused on blowing apart our network. Next slide. So in 2012, Ash Carter, who was then the Undersecretary of Defense for AT&L, Acquisition Technology and Logistics, he set up the SCOPE, the Strategic Capabilities Office. It was the first objective indication that the department was getting uneasy with the trends in military technical superiority, specifically in the Western Pacific. In 2014, Secretary Hagel announced the Defense Innovation Initiative. These are quotes from his speech when he announced it. You know, he said, look, we've spent too much time focused on the Middle East. Russia and China have been investing heavily to blunt our military technological edge. The DIA is going to be a defense-wide effort to invest in innovative ways to sustain and advance our dominance. And it's going to explore new operational concepts. And from the very beginning, wargaming was absolutely central to the DII. Next slide. Now, I put this up for a very specific reason. People always ask me, hey, what happened to the third offset strategy? And you'll see that nowhere in the lines of effort did the word third offset strategy ever show up. Line of effort one was that we're going to adopt a defense strategy for a long-term strategic competition with great powers. We actually started a project in policy which came up with a strategy for both Russia and China, but they came too late in the Obama administration to make any type of an impact at all. So you should see the National Defense Strategy of 2018 as the natural end result of line of effort one. Line of effort two, the DII essentially said the way you get transformational change is not through technology per se, but in operational concepts and organizational constructs that provide military advantage, that exploit technology in a way that provides military advantage. All of the new concepts of operation, multi-domain operations, expeditionary advanced base operations, distributed maritime operations, agile logistics, all of those you can trace back to the DII. Now, number three was based upon the way that the department pursued the second offset strategy in 1973. And at that time, they stood up a thing called the Long Range Research and Development Planning Program. And it was a competitive strategy to preserve and widen military technical superiority. That turned into the third offset strategy. And one of my greatest regrets as deputy secretary is that third offset strategy became shorthand for line of effort three, and later became shorthand for the whole DII, which completely washed out all of the other things that were happening in support of the DII. Now, we use the term competitive strategy, which is a business term. In fact, it's kind of fallen out of vogue. But here's one of the definitions that I pulled out of an old business book. Define how to create and maintain a competitive advantage with respect to competitors. I had a big argument with Secretary Mattis because the first time we talked about the third offset strategy, he said, "Work, the third offset strategy isn't a strategy." And I said, "Of course it is, sir. It's a competitive strategy." And he just said, "But it's not a strategy. We have to have a broader strategy." And I said, "You're absolutely right. That was our first line of effort, but we didn't get that done." So this was one of my big advantages. And the big thing I want you to remember always was, how do we create and maintain a competitive advantage? Line of effort 4 was expanding wargaming experimentation. Line of effort 5 was improved capability management. And what that was, look, you have capabilities and you reveal some capabilities for deterrence and you conceal for warfighting advantage. We wanted to improve DoD and IC integration. We wanted to expand the number of supported stakeholders in the White House, Congress, allies, and industry. And we wanted to improve collaboration and R&D between the department and the commercial innovation base. I wanted to put this up because everyone thinks that the third offset strategy was all about technology. The third offset strategy was focused on military technical superiority, without question, but it was only one of 7 lines of effort. Next slide, please. Now, line of effort 3 concluded that the best competitive strategy would be a deliberate, aggressive departmental push towards AI-enabled autonomous applications and operations. It really was influenced most by the Defense Science Board and its summer study on autonomy. And this is a quote that basically said, look, we think that autonomy, fueled by advances in AI, has attained a tipping point in value. And so DoD has to take immediate action to accelerate. Now, the way we conceived of it, we conceived of these as intelligent machines, and the applications were conceived of as human-directed narrow task as opposed to general AI. This was narrow AI systems in our view. The human would assign a mission and the intelligent machine would perform tasks in support. The best definition we came up with was it has a degree of self-governance and control, and it has a human's proxy to make reasoned choices among self-developed courses of action. That's the way we defined narrow task AI systems. They could create their own courses of action and choose among them. General AI can make their own goals and choose among them. But the third offset strategy was focused clearly on narrow AI systems. Next slide, please. So it was all about the autonomy. That became the conceptual foundation of the third offset strategy. And we hypothesized that this is how we would gain competitive advantage. We'd increase the quality and speed of decisions and action. We'd enable new missions that would otherwise be impossible. We'd reduce the number of warfighters in harm's way, and we thought it would help restore conventional overmatch and strengthen deterrence. Next slide. There were 2 different types of AI-enabled autonomy in our view. Autonomy at rest, which was in software, intelligence support, planning, expert advisory, predictive maintenance, anything like that. All of them, in our view, was designed to help humans make better decisions, not machines. Help humans make better decisions, so we always referred to this as human-machine collaboration. And the exemplar we had in mind was a project DARPA had, which was called Deep Green in the early 2000s, and AI just wasn't up to what Deep Green was trying to do. But you can see the slide. The commander would choose an option, the AI would sketch to decide, would present options and second-order effects. It would come back to the commander. The commander would choose the option that he wanted. Then he would sketch the plan. You'd run it through Blitzkrieg, and then you put it into Crystal Ball. And all of this was designed to make decisions better. Next slide. Of course, you also had autonomy in motion. Don't have to say a lot about this. We saw this in terms of human-machine combat teaming. And for some specified missions, you'd have machine-to-machine combat teaming, especially on collaborative weapon attacks, like the Network-Enabled Collaborative Weapons Project, which DARPA calls CODE. And you'd have combat swarms, etc. Next slide. So this is what the hypothesis was. You would start to take these narrow task AI systems, AI-enabled systems, and you would start to inject them in all 4 of the grids. Autonomy at rest and autonomy at motion. You would start to use widespread digital machine-to-machine communications. And we hypothesized that that would lead to extraordinary increases in battle network performances. Next slide. And we saw at some tipping point, you'd have so many different injections into the battle network that you would come up with what we referred to as a human-machine collaborative battle network. And you can see more rapid decisions and more rapid action. And we thought that the human-machine collaborative battle network would be the physical manifestation of what we called algorithmic warfare. Next slide, please. Now, this is the definition of algorithmic warfare, and it comes directly from our friends, the Chinese. This is their definition of what they refer to as intelligentized combat operations, which is algorithmic warfare. Combat operations conducted with intelligent weapons and equipment platforms using AI as the core with tech support from info networks, big data, cloud computing, Internet of Things, and intelligent control. We adopted that as our definition of algorithmic warfare. Next slide. Now, one aim of the DII was to spark a department-wide cycle of research to test these hypotheses. We always referred to these as hypotheses. And as Phil Pornell, who I think is listening today, he wrote an article in 2014, which I still have, and he described the cycle of research as an iterative application of principal tools the military uses to explore, understand, and prepare for future conflict. And the principal tools, as I think most of the people in this informed audience would know, includes all of these things used in concert. So that was the thinking behind DII. We wanted to get into this cycle of research so that we can start to understand this coming period of the mature revolutionary regime and the potential move to algorithmic warfare. We wanted to be the first mover, just like we were in Desert Storm and the first mover in the guided munitions battle network regime. Next slide. So LOE4, Wargaming and Experimentation. In 2011, CAPE kind of brought in the JAS, the Joint Analysis System, and they archived it. People could still use it, but we no longer used it in as broad of a way as we used to. So in my view, when I was looking at the world, campaign simulations and analysis had been rather emasculated in the department, and sequestration was limiting money for major exercises. So my initial focus really fell on wargaming and experimentation, which led to my 9 February 2014 memo, which said, okay, look, if we're going to understand what the heck is happening in here, we have to make better use of limited resources and reinvigorate wargaming. We had a wargaming summit, which brought all of the the service vices in, and all of their senior wargaming people. We said, what do we need to do to make this work? They said, look, the sequestration and the Budget Control Act forced us to take a lot of money out of wargaming. We need help. So we started the Wargaming Incentive Fund, added 10 million there, and the Warfighting Lab Incentive Fund, which was focused on experimentation, like Hunter, Warrior, Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, 10 million. We started a wargaming repository because here I was at the DMAG, the Defense Management Action Group, and I was making decisions with the vice chairman and all of the senior leaders in the department on what we should procure and how much we should procure and what we should stop procuring. And wargaming results never came to us. And so the repository was really designed to do that. You can see what within 3 years this led to. I was very pleased there. But the key regret I now have is I didn't know about connections. The intent of LOE4 was to explore the 3OS hypotheses, in my view. Instead, as I look back over time, it really focused more on new capabilities. Had I known about connections, I might have tried to bring it in under the Advanced Capabilities and Deterrence panel and said, look, what I really want to do is to explore third offset hypotheses. And to do that, we have to get AI into our war games. We have to use AI to make better war games. And we have to be able to simulate what all of these AI-enabled applications would do. Next one. So here's the questions I have for you, and the questions that kind of just bubbled into my head after looking at your awesome agenda. Has the community of interest sufficiently improved the ability to wargame non-kinetic or systemic effects? And when you're moving away from attritionist type outcomes where you're really trying to blow apart a network to gain advantage, at that time, at least in 2015, I didn't think we were very good in gaming, cyber attacks, system destruction warfare, and the op-tempo improvements through AI-enabled autonomy. I just didn't think we were there. Looking at, I saw James Carbo Cyber Aware talk and John Curry's about tactical cyber. And so I started to think as I looked at this, I said, wow, maybe we're getting to where we can really start to do this. The question is, to me now, is jazz good enough? Is it good enough for us to pull out and really start to improve with some AI-enabled modules, et cetera? If not, is there something else we should go for? I know many of you are probably laughing at me because I still refer to jazz, but at that time, you know, I was just so upset that it wasn't really being used. And even though it wasn't the greatest model, I'm certain it was better than us sitting around a table and saying, should we buy more hypersonics or should we buy more cyber? Hopefully simulations would have helped illuminate some of our choices. And so John Tiller, you know, Wargaming AI and ML, I was thinking perhaps that is the way we might be able to look at some of these models. What's the most effective combination? I saw Alec Barker from Group W, you know, peering into the future on AI-enabled war games. And another class or talk on developing combat behavior through reinforcement learning. So I think this group is already thinking about this. And how do we make portfolio choices? As a former deputy secretary, as you might expect, this is very, very important to me. So I know there's a representative AI platform. I won't say which one it is because I'm not here hawking any particular company. But what they did is they're working with the Air Force programmers with Storm and this AI platform. And this is a quote from one of them. You know, hey, we were able to propose 3 times more planning choices in seconds, not weeks, for exactly the same cost. And it helped quantitatively determine the return on investment. Wow, I would have loved something like that as the Deputy Secretary of Defense. The last thing, I didn't see anything on the agenda, is I think wargaming is going to have to help us train and select commanders proficient in algorithmic warfare. And I refer to these in my mind as Ender's games. You know, if all we do, if all future commanders do, is take the course of action recommended by an intelligent machine, then why have the commander? Just go completely autonomous. What we need is commanders to accept AI developed course of action and use them with their experience and their fingertip feel. And those are the commanders we want, because those are the commanders that will excel in algorithmic warfare. Next slide. Look, if we really want to do something, we'll find a way. And if we don't, you'll find an excuse. I am so happy that you are exploring this topic. And I encourage you all to continue in this vein. It's really going to be important for the Department of Defense to continue to explore what a mature revolutionary regime looks like and get away from attritionist models and really start to focus on systems confrontation as the basic form of warfare, and figure out how AI helps. Now, I spoke a little longer than I intended, but I am very much looking forward to your questions.
All right, our first question is, the quality of war games has also been seen as fairly uneven, how did you weigh the quality of the different games you participated in while the Deputy Secretary of Defense?
Well, most of the games that I participated in were seminar-style games with a white cell adjudication. And so the games that I really value are the ones that start to explore different concepts of operations and really start to me thinking about, hey, how does the joint force have to change? I am nowhere near on the same playing field as the people in this conference. I'm constantly getting schooled by Phil Pornell, who writes me an email and says, man, that was a pretty stupid thing to say. And that's the type of thing as a deputy secretary you really value. So that's why I enjoyed the 20XX war games so much. When they first started, we brought people in and said, hey, here we are, we're in a mature revolutionary regime, figure out some concepts of operation. And the first 2 or 3 games were total losers. They were just worthless. What we found we had to do is we had to make a playbook. We had to describe in detail the capabilities of systems that we foresaw in this regime. And we handed the playbook to the operators. And with that playbook, the operators really got down to it. And man, we learned so much. So in my view, the best games for senior leaders are the ones that really start to open their mind. For the department and figuring, and then the second best, I guess, is the portfolio balancing. What is the best combination of capabilities that we can procure to provide us with the most likely aspect of military technical superiority? But you were right. Look, CAPE used to laugh. Some of the people in the Warfighting Incentive, Wargaming Incentive Fund called their process the beauty contest. And people would come forward and say, hey, we're going to do this game. And, we could have done a lot better. But I was just so happy that the number of games were increasing. We were getting the results of the game in the repository. People, as Catherine said, I really felt that we had triggered more we had triggered more wargaming activity, and it was benefiting the department. Sorry about that. It was too long of an answer.
Not a problem. Your next question is, how would you rate the relative importance of the intellectual preparation of people versus the preparation and utilization of AI?
At least equal. But look, wars are fought by people. And the whole hypothesis of the third offset was AI-enabled narrow task systems were going to help humans operate better. So I guess I've just answered your question. It really is a focus on the people and exploring what are the best AI-enabled narrow task systems which make humans better decision makers, operators, etc. But the way I look at this is, if you pull somebody out of 1960 and you said, "Hey, I have a Ford Edge," and you put that person in the Ford Edge, they would just be astounded. Lane departure warnings, automatic cruise control, autonomous braking action when you're going to crash or back into somebody, all of these things, they would think, I believe, that this car is a general AI car, that the car itself was intelligent. And it's not. It's just the infusion of narrow AI task systems all working together that lead to a human-machine collaborative transportation system. It's completely different than a car in the 1960s. And so it's important for us to understand that, but going back, it's most important to understand how it impacts human commanders and operators.
Thank you. The next question is something of a help us help you. What advice do you have for connections in the wargaming community to help get current and future leaders to better engage with connections and the wargaming community in light of your earlier expressed regret?
It's a great question, and one that I want to talk to Catherine about. You know, I think it's important that the top level, either the secretary or the deputy secretary, make clear how important they value wargaming. And then I am certain that they don't know anything about connections. I can't state for certain, but I'm certain, 99.99% certain that they've never heard of connections. And connections could possibly provide an awful lot of help. I've been watching some of the chats and things, people who come in and say, look, we need to go in a whole different direction in wargaming, in wargame architectures. If we had $15 million, that would allow us to pursue these type of games that would really help. I have no idea if jazz can be improved through AI modules, but the big thing is, what is the war game designed to do? One really needs to focus on the DMAG and the deputy secretary and the vice chairman. I can't tell you how many people would come and say, what is our return on investment on the cyber? And we didn't know. The only way we could answer that question is to buy cyber by the pound. And that's what we did. I would like to be able to have simulation games of campaigns and a systems confrontation, which would say, look, your next marginal dollar, you should consider investing in tactical cyber rather than another 100 hypersonic weapons. You'll actually get a higher campaign payoff if you do that. Those type of games would be extraordinarily useful.
All right, we're running short on time, so I'm going to try and put in too big a question for the end. What do you see as the asymmetries in how the Russians, the Chinese, and the US will incorporate and use the AI that we should examine in war games?
Man, I've been out of the intelligence cycle for 3 years now. My sense is that the Russians are really focused on combat robotics. So they're really focused on autonomy in motion. The Chinese appear to be more focused on autonomy at rest and how it impacts decision making. So that's my initial thought. The other initial thought is that the Russians appear on their tactical cyber and their systems confrontation. They really focus on breaking connections, breaking link 16, breaking satellite connections, doing all of those things. Whereas, the Chinese appear to really be, focused on breaking down the network, whereas the Russians appear to want to go in and change the data, and they're absolutely happy for us to continue our actions based on bad intel or bad data. So I can't really answer the question because I haven't been in the intelligence, I haven't been a consumer of intelligence for a long time. But man, that would be at the very top of my list if I was the deputy secretary. How are the Chinese and Russians thinking about using AI? The Chinese are we took their definition of intelligentized warfare and just said, okay, this is what we're talking about too. So they're seeing it in exactly the same way that those of us who worked on the third offset thought about it.
All right, well, apparently we didn't finish our time, which is great. So, feeding you yet another question. We got a question on how will we convince ourselves that we should turn over control of lethal weapons to AI systems? When will that day come, and how would we get to it when it does?
I don't think it will ever come, at least not in the West. It might come. It is clear that the Russians are very, very comfortable going all the way and saying, okay, we will allow the machine to make the choice when and where. I think it's very important that the Chinese, Russians, and US talk about autonomous weapon systems that can order preemptive or retaliatory strikes. To me, that's leads to extremely unstable crisis conditions. But from the United States point of view, the human will always make the decision to apply force on the battlefield. Now, here's the gray area. It happens in what I'll call a two-stage guided munition, like the ATACMS with the brilliant anti-armor technology submunition. First stage blows out, takes a bus out and puts it over a group of weapons. Then it poops out submunitions, which each on their own independently pick the specific target they're going to attack. In my view, that is just an extension of the commander's decision. I want to kill every target in that group. And I don't care if the machine chooses a specific target. If it chooses a target that's in its automatic target recognition library and it services it, that's totally okay. That to me is human control of the kill chain to the end. People who don't like autonomous weapons disagree. They say the fact that the submunition makes the choice on its own without human intervention is a terrible thing. The other one is what I'll call prescribed pursuit weapons, like the LOCAS, the low-cost autonomous attack system, which was developed because of the Scud problem. It goes out and searches a kill box, and if it finds a target that's been approved in its ATR library, it attacks it on its own. That, to me, is where you'll see machines making the choice to attack a target. But I consider those extensions of a commander's choice. A commander says, Scuds are in the Western Desert. I know there are Bedouins out there, but as a matter of proportionality and military necessity, I've got to stop a WMD attack against Israel. I am willing to risk some non-combatant casualties to prevent that horror from occurring. And so any Scud that it finds, kill it. And if the Scud happens to be parked against a civilian tanker truck that's refilling it, well, that still falls. That's still entirely consistent with international humanitarian law because of the principle of proportionality and military necessity. So in my view, the US is never going to turn it all the way over to machines. And that's what I would say in the war games. It's going to be a little easier in the initial aspect. If you ever get to a general AI system, that's going to be, okay, it's going to be another independent actor on the battlefield that makes its own decisions. But the narrow AI systems will be given, okay, you can make courses of action to achieve this task that I've told you to do, and you can choose among them. And it seems to me that that would be easier to incorporate into a war game than general AI systems.
Okay, sir, we are over time, and I can't think of a better way to spend our time. I don't think there's a single person listening to you that would rather have a full-length break than your insights. And on behalf of Tim Wilkie, all the hosts, all the folks that have been helping us with CNA and the whole planning committee, this has been fantastic. This has been, I think, the best keynote we've had, and I very much appreciate all you've done before today, all your comments today, and all I'm safe you're going to do in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and to all of the people who are listening, or I compliment CNA for hosting the connections. I compliment all of the people who are part of the connections, and all I have to say is wargaming is so important to us now because we're in this potential revolutionary period, and we have to kind of figure it out. And in my view, the best way to do that is through simulations, analysis, wargaming, exercises, once we start to have concepts that we can test. So thank you all for what you do. God bless you.
Thank you, sir.